Explained by the Billy Meier contacts. Mysteries, myths, legends, conspiracy theories, historical inaccuracies, and more. Compiled by David Chance, revised October 18, 2023.
George Washington French and Indian War. See also 7 Years' War. Contact Report 544.
Then there was the President George Washington, who actually started the First World War with the 7 Years' War from 1756 to 1763, which means that 3 world wars have already taken place, and not just 2. Although your father Svath already told me that, but I had completely forgotten it, so I only stumbled upon it again through this chronicle here. Well, Washington, as a military leader in the War of Independence, as a liberal thinker, was also a shrewd leader of state when the Constitution was being drafted. At the age of 22, he was still a British officer in the American colonies. He was thereby then involved in an incident that was fundamentally the cause of the real First World War, which shook the earth. With 160 soldiers, in 1754, he patrolled the Ohio Valley between British and French territories. In May of that year, the French sent a diplomat to get Washington out of their territory. However, the latter ordered the firing on the diplomatic corps, wherethrough the French negotiator and about 13 of his soldiers who went with him were deliberately murdered, with Washington's hope of driving a wedge between the French and the British, because only such a conflict between the two colonial powers could lead to the success regarding the American War of Independence. This felony led to the triggering of the so-called French and Indian War, from which, 2 years later, emerged the bloody conflicts between the great European powers, and thus the 7 Years' War, which was fought in America, Europe, and Asia, and therefore was worldwide, which is why this was the real First World War, which is however concealed from the world's population.
Contact Report 555.
The 2 official wars were already in the 20th century, but if the 7-Year War from 1756 to 1763 is added, which was effectively a world war and which was fought in America, Europe, and Asia, then the Fourth World War would be imminent. The First World War was triggered by the murderous machinations of George Washington, the later first U.S. president, who was then still a British officer in the American colonies and had a French delegation of negotiators assassinated.
Contact Report 673.
The conspiracy was staged by the slave owner Augustine Washington, born in Great Britain in 1693 and deceased in 1743, the father of the later first president of America, George Washington. The conspirators counted several thousand colonists, who secretly called themselves Americans in their circles and who strove to establish their own form of government, which, however, was kept secret from the outside under threat of death, which is why nothing in writing was ever recorded and nothing was ever written to the outside, so that the whole thing could always be kept secret, even to this day. In 1732, his son, George Washington, was born, who then became the first president of the United States of America and died in 1799. Early on, he was involved in the conspiracy of his father, to whom he was completely addicted, following with his followers also the goal of his own American state formation, and did not omit anything to achieve this goal one day. Although he lacked a good school education, as well as a valuable general education, because he was very uneducated, unread, and ignorant, which he could later improve with the help of a decisive woman. Overall, however, he was able to cover up the whole thing to a large extent, to which his origin as part of the economic and cultural elite of the slavery plantation owners of the state of Virginia came in very handy to him, because through his origin he also came into contact with a wealthy and influential and very cultivated nobleman named Lord William Fairfax, and won his trust and help. He also owned large estates in Great Britain. At the age of 16, George Washington met the pretty daughter-in-law of Fairfax, Sally Fairfax, with whom he immediately fell in love and established an intimate adulterous relationship with her, which both secretly entertained. Both kept this adulterous liaison alive, but of course secret. This woman was the one who taught him in diverse knowledge and also improved his very weak general education. The secret conspiracy was maintained by George Washington and all co-conspirators. When his half-brother Lawrence Washington married Fairfax's daughter, Anne, he was of course also part of the family and was treated as a family member by her, which made the liaison with Sally Fairfax much easier, which was never known either in the family or to the outside world, because both were absolutely silent about their intimate relationship. George Washington was commissioned in the autumn of 1753 by the Deputy Governor of Virginia, Robert Dinwiddie, to carry out a diplomatic mission, namely that he, as the issuer, should send a letter to the French asking them, on behalf of the British Crown, by Dinwiddie and other representatives of Virginia, to give up and leave their outposts in an area disputed between France and England. Washington set out on its mission on 31st October, after which he and his companions were received politely and courteously by the French and treated accordingly, but who were not prepared to make any concessions. This mission, however, brought George Washington public attention for the first time, even though he had failed as an issuer. Nevertheless, in the spring of 1754, when he was only 22 years old, Governor Dinwiddie entrusted him, with the approval of the Virginia House of Representatives, to take command of a small militia troop of 160 men in the spring of 1754, with the task of observing the French outposts located in the Western Territories as well as the strategically important points. So Washington got a military position of power and gathered the Indian allies around him and had makeshift forts built in order to defend itself better against possible attacks of the superior French forces. In this episode, Washington saw itself in a position to put its and its co-conspirators' conspiracy idea of striving for its own state Americans into the limelight, even if the realization would still take years and it would use great military means because it now had the opportunity to do so and it could gain great military power. So, in May 1754, the Washington troops and a French troop engaged in combat because he ordered an attack, even though the French troops were under the command of a Joseph de Jumonville, who was on his way as an emissary. Washington, his troop, of course, in principle, emerged victorious from the provoked struggle, which was effectively a raid in which the French commander capitulated, but which George Washington, shortly after the battle, had executed in his delusion of power. Less than a month later, Washington himself and his troops were captured by superior French soldiers, capitulating after many of his troops had been killed. The French described the fusillierung of the commander Joseph de Jumonville as what it actually was, namely as murder, which Washington also confirmed in a corresponding document, whereby the French granted mercy before justice and released him, after which he then denied the murder he had committed again. And it was these incidents, triggered by George Washington, who was full of hatred and thoughts of revenge against the French and who saw himself as Americans, and thus as American, that led to the war from 1754 to 1763, which from the American point of view is called the French and Indian War, which is regarded as a partial conflict of the 7 Years' War, which then broke out in 1756. And since at that time the entire origin of the First World War began with the machinations and triggered armed conflicts of the aforementioned Americans or early American George Washington, by whose provocation the whole thing could come about. In the first place, in the background, together with his thousand-fold Americans co-conspirators, it is clear to us that the First World War was triggered by the USA with its first citizens, who secretly called themselves Americans or American in a later sense. So George Washington's coping strategy worked, but his and his co-conspirators' intentions did not actually materialize until he became one of the founding fathers of the United States as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army from 1775 to 1783, with the first states emerging from the 13 colonies in 1776. In 1789 to 1797, he became the first President of the United States of America.
But what is interesting is that to this day, nothing has ever become public about this Americans conspiracy.
Every announcement, however small, has been punished with death.
Are you saying that that's why people were actually murdered?
Yes, there are 73 people in my father's annals who were hanged by the conspirators.
This is typical for the USA, even in those days when it was not called United States of America, but was called Americans by the conspirators, which is equivalent to America. And that you judge and describe the thing World War I, in which Europe was also involved and which was effectively global, as originating from the USA, that is really plausible, logical, and therefore to be understood, because the conspirator George Washington was just as much an Americans as his co-conspirators were, and his insidious warlike murderous machinations led to war.
As you say, this assessment is logical.
Contact Report 704.
And this was already the case at the earliest and most fundamental times, when George Washington, before he advanced to become the first U.S. president, had a white-flagged French negotiating troop treacherously shot dead.
Contact Report 717.
1947. Even George Washington, who held the presidency as the first president of the United States of America from 1789 to 1797, was a murderer, war criminal, and traitor.
Contact Report 791.
And the fact that the American rulers are naive in their obsession with power, but the U.S. president is particularly naive, and do not notice that they, the rulers, that is to say the supreme boss and his satellites, are secretly influenced from the outside by the dark leadership, does not break the camel's back, but it is enough for everything to slowly get more and more out of hand. Moreover, the whole thing is common practice in the USA, and has been since time immemorial, ever since the first president, George Washington, came to power after the American War of Independence, following a murder he committed in 1781, and was called the Father of the American Nation. Note: the year 1781 is likely referring to the year in which Washington came to power, rather than the year he committed murder, 1754.
Contact Report 842.
As we have followed the events on Earth since ancient times, and as our records prove, America was founded in its very beginnings by murder, when a certain George Washington shot a peacenik without hearing him when he came with a white flag to negotiate peace.
Contact Report 851.
America's first president, George Washington, was, after all, a murderer who summarily shot a lieutenant of the French before he could even speak a word, when the latter, armed with a white peace flag on the bayonet of his rifle and with 11 men, wanted to ask for a truce. So he was a murderer, as was his father, Augustin Washington, a wealthy plantation owner who had several thousand acres of land worked by slaves and beat 2 of his 60 or so slaves to death with his own hands.